But I'm really looking forward to this. I've been looking forward to this event for a while, and I'm so impressed with what Measure Minds has pulled together to make GA forward, and I love that name too. So today, I'm Fred Pike, as Phil introduced me. I'm a managing director at Northwoods in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I'm the GA GTM practice lead. And last year, this is what my wife and I lived through. We did a reconstruction of our kitchen, our family room, and one of the bathrooms, and it was pretty painful. But at one point, I remember turning to my wife and saying, "You know what? This reminds me of GA4." And she looked at me. It's like, "How can this remind you of GA4?" And I said, "Well, look, we've got walls, we have windows, we have ceilings, we're protected from the elements. That's kind of what your basic GA4 implementation gives you. You know, you have, you're tracking page views, you're tracking file downloads, you're tracking search terms, things like that. So pretty cool. But what you need to do to really build out that implementation of GA4 is the same thing we needed to do at our house. We had to take all these tools, all this construction material, and personalize it for what we wanted. Now, obviously, we were not the ones doing the work, thank God. You don't want me anywhere near a hammer, but the process is very similar to what we do with GA4. So what we're going to do today is kind of walk through some of that process. And I think I could spend 4 hours or more on this. So I'm going to try to keep it short, but we will have time for questions afterwards, or potentially in the speaker lounge afterwards too. So today we're going to talk about what to track on, really we say B2B, but it's any type of website. It's just not an e-commerce one where there's a lot of e-commerce stuff to track it, but any website, there's things we want to track. We want to talk about how to track it. What are we going to do to track that? And then what to call it. Now, I am a huge, huge fan of Google Tag Manager. And all the examples I'm going to be talking about today revolve around Google Tag Manager. And since we're in the technical track now, I thought it would be okay to get a little bit nerdy, a little bit technical in some of the things that we'll talk about. If you really want to personalize your implementation of GA4, the best place to do that is through Google Tag Manager. There's absolutely no doubt about that. So that's why I'm really going to hit this. So let's start off with what to track, which is, you know, kind of an important thing for a website, right? In our home construction project, we had a whole bunch of things we had to track. We had to track, like, when they were moving the ductwork. We had to track when they were removing the wood-burning stove, removing the chimney, installing the heated floor in the bathroom, just a whole bunch of stuff, you know, and that's what a website person in GA4 wants to do too. So what are you going to track? And what you want to track in GA4 on your website are meaningful user interactions. Now, that could be different for every website, right? My website, a meaningful user interaction may be very different than yours. However, there are some things that are probably in common across most websites. So I'm going to focus on 4 of those, and we'll look at how we can track those. The first is CTAs, calls to action. There are so many websites that, you know, have these buttons, these calls to action. Does anybody click on them? Do you know? Are you tracking them? Are they effective? Are they working for you? If you don't track them, you don't know. They just may be there and no one may ever click on them. So CTAs is one of the first things that I always want to track when I'm working on a new website. Shares. Are you sharing blog content to Twitter or other social media? Probably not Twitter anymore, but Mastodon or other social media accounts or whatever. Search terms. Are you capturing those search terms? And GA4 does a pretty good job of that, except in some circumstances, which we'll talk about. Forms, of course. If you have forms on your website, you want to track if people fill them out, right? And then I'm going to talk, I don't know what to call this, but something that is blocking a user from being effective on your website. So I'm going to show kind of an interesting example of that, I think. Here's what we're going to look at, and you'll see it in a second. So let's talk about now how to track it. And by the way, that whole what to track, I mean, that can be a really long discussion because you really want to think about your website and those meaningful user interactions that are important to you. So we could spend, several hours just on that, but we're not going to. We're just going to talk about those four that I just mentioned. And now let's talk about how to track it. And again, we're using GTM. We're in the technical track here, so we'll get a little bit nerdy, which I hope is okay. So some popular options. The first is looking at CSS and HTML elements that are on the page. And this kind of assumes that you don't have any access to the back end. You can't get in there. You as the GA4 implementer have to use what's on that page already. You have no access to the back end. The second is you do have access to the back end. So you can put in some custom classes, some custom CSS classes, and you can add some data attributes, and we'll show how that could be used. And then finally, kind of my favorite thing in GA4 and in GA3 too, are the data layer pushes where you're working with a developer and he or she is sending some information into the data layer, which GTM can then do something with. We'll talk about quite a bit more about that in a little bit. So to do this whole thing, what are the tools that we're going to use? If we're going to build a house, obviously we need screwdrivers and things like that. Here we're going to use the developer console. And the developer console is one of those things that people are sometimes a little bit afraid of going into because there's so much in there. But the developer console is one of my favorite tools because it really is like an onion. You can go in there not knowing much and get some information out. The more you know, the deeper you can get into the information structure. And so it's really a good thing to get used to the developer console. But I'm also going to use the GTM GA debugger from David Vallejo, which puts a kind of a nice structure around what's happening in the developer console. And we'll show you that in just a little bit. So if you don't have that Chrome extension yet, you can either use this QR code or use the fredpike.me thing URL to download it. So before we start diving into how to track these things, let's talk a little bit about GA4 events. And you probably know all this, so we're not going to go into it deeply. But everything in GA4 is an event. Everything is an event, unlike in Universal Analytics. So every event in GA4 has an event name, like form submitted, for example, and it has event parameters, up to 25 around each event, that describe that event. And I really kind of like this approach because it's how humans approach the world, I think. If I say, hey, I just bought a new guitar, you may ask me, is it acoustic or electric? Is it steel string or nylon string? What brand is it? Where did you buy it? How much was it? Those are all parameters that describe that event, bought a guitar. So I think GA4 events, that whole GA4 event model corresponds really, really well with how we think about the world. So everything has an event, and there are up to 25 different parameters that describe it. So let's start diving in a little bit. The first example I'm going to show you is one where we have no access. So we are going to rely solely on what's on the page, the CSS and the HTML. And the example is going to be a CTA, and I'm going to use Irish Fest for this example. And I just have to call that up. And here, by the way, is that Chrome extension. So Irish Fest, biggest Irish festival in the world, happens each August in Milwaukee. And if we look at, let me move this up a little bit. You see that they've got CTAs, right? These buttons that they want you to click on. They want you to interact with the website with those buttons. So if we move that up just a bit, if I inspect this button, again, remember, I don't have access to the back end. So I just want to see what we have here. Look, we have a span.button. I don't know if you can see it. It'll show up right here when I hover over it. So span.button. Without really knowing anything about the site, I can be pretty secure that every call to action button is going to be a span.button. And if I click on that, here we'll go over into the analytics debugger. If I click on this, let's see if anything happens in GA4. well, it calls up another window, but going back over here. So the analytics debugger breaks things out into GTM, GTAG interactions, GA3 and GA4. If we go to GA4, we see that we have this event called click. And I know there's a lot on this screen. I said that it kind of cleans up the developer console interface. It does. It also adds a lot of some level of complexity, but once you get used to it, it's really nice. So this event, click, shows up there as the event, and the event parameters, again, those things that describe that event are click type of CTA. And I know that just because of that span dot button, link text, learn more, and then the link URL where it's going to. So I've now captured a user interaction on this website, somebody clicking on the CTA. So eventually when I have a lot of those user interactions, I could see, okay, what drives better interaction with these CTAs? Is it paid traffic? Is it organic traffic? Is it stuff from the email, et cetera? Now I'm beginning to collect data on some meaningful user interactions, and later I can analyze them. If we go back to our presentation, I'm not going to go into GTM, but I'm going to show you what's happening in GTM. So the first thing is that I have a trigger which looks at the click element, that whole thing that I clicked on, and it matches a CSS selector of span.button or span.button, anything below that, that's what the asterisk means. And in Irishfest's case, they also have, for different sets of buttons, they call them button 2. Pretty interesting, right? So now anytime I click on one of those buttons, this trigger is going to fire, and this GA4 event, which I call GA4 event CTA, is going to fire with the click type of CTA. You saw that in the debugger that I just showed you, and the link text and the link URL. So not too hard to set up, even without having any access to the backend. I have a lot of power on what I can track. And once you figure out, it can be a little bit tricky to work with the click elements, but once you figure that out, it actually becomes pretty straightforward. So not hard, even when you don't have access to the backend. Now, let's see what happens when you do have access to the backend. And by having access to the backend, I mean, you can actually go in to the HTML code, the CSS, and make changes yourself, or somebody on your team can do that. It doesn't necessarily have to do that, be you. So here I'm going to do a different site where we have what we call faux CSS classes and data attributes. And I call them faux, actually a developer I worked with first came up with that term, I think. They're a class in the CSS, but it has nothing to do with, you know, color or anything else that CSS normally controls. It's just there for GTM to grab. As a matter of fact, sometimes I call it GTM dash something. And then data attributes we'll talk about too. But we're still tracking CTAs. Now we have access to the backend, so maybe we can track things a little bit better or a little bit deeper. So let's go back to our site over here. Actually, we can close this one. And bring that down a bit. Let's see, I want to see if there is, okay. So here we have Novus Home Mortgage, a mortgage company. If we inspect here, we have a span class of button, kind of like what we had on Irishfest, but here's that faux CSS class of CTA. That means nothing really to the CSS. That's for GTM. And then we have this data click type of CTA. Okay, so we're saying that this is kind of a category of CTA, and this particular click we're going to call a CTA, as opposed to one of these down here. And let me move up here. So we have this 5-step loan process. Here we have that faux class again of CTA, and the data click time this time is digital loan process. So because we have access to the backend, we can differentiate that these clicks. They're not all CTAs. The big category may be CTA, but some are true CTAs, some are part of the digital loan process, some are part of finding a loan officer, et cetera. So if I click on this one, for example, and go back to Analytics Debugger and look at GA4, there's my click. There's my event name of click. And if I look at the event parameters, I have a click type of CTA, complete my application, and login. So I have some pretty good information, some more thorough information than I had on the Irish Fest site. In fact, if we look at, let me move forward a bit here. If we look at the type of click types that we're capturing on this site, we have a generic CTA. We've got ones that are on the loan officer page, loan officer by name, digital loan process, et cetera. So because we have access to the back end, we can actually refine the tracking that we're doing, which is pretty cool. That data attribute is a huge thing that we as GA4 implementers can and should be using a lot. So let's back up here and take a look at what actually happened. That element, the click type element, you can capture that as a variable in GTM, as a data layer variable. And it's pretty easy. It's GTM element data set, and then whatever you called it. You might remember we call that data-click type. So here it's just click type. You don't need the data portion. So we had like CTA as one of the click types. We had the digital loan process. That would be captured in this variable. Cool. What do we do with that? We have a trigger, again, that fires when somebody clicks on a button that has that CTA selector, that CTA faux CSS class that we saw just now. And then we go into the GA4 event itself. And here's where it's different from Irish Fest. You probably remember in Irish Fest, the click type was hard-coded to CTA, right? I just physically type that in, CTA. Here, we're pulling that variable from the data click type and putting it in as a click type, and that's how we get this information in GA4. That's how the CTA, loan officer page, digital loan process, et cetera. So that's giving us without having deep developer skills, as long as we have access to the back end, we can do a lot fairly simply in GA4 to track this particular user interaction, this meaningful user interaction, and break it down into the different categories. That is so cool, I think. That's a really nice feature. So moving forward, we've begun to flesh out our house, right? Our kitchen doesn't just have bare walls and studs. We now have some better looking walls up. We have, we're far from done, but this is beginning to look a little bit more livable. We have fleshed out our GA4 implementation. Pretty cool. Next one, data layer push. Data layer pushes I just love. So the data layer is a place where all these different applications can send data, and GTM will listen for things in that data layer and then respond to them. That's probably not the best explanation, but it's just a way to transfer information between different applications. It could be the browser, it could be anything else that you're interacting with. And what they look like, so every data layer push has both an event, and that's key. Your data layer push has to have an event. So here's an example where it's on a contact us page, and you could contact the person via email, via phone, via vCard, et cetera. So we wanted to track how people were contacting the team members. So the event through a data layer push is contact a team member. The name of the person, you can call this anything you want. I chose to call it Fred Pike. The contact type is email, but it could be vCard, phone, LinkedIn, et cetera. And then the page that they're going to. So that one interaction that user had on clicking on, hey, I want to contact Fred Pike, now shows up in this data layer push. And what can I do with it? what I'm going to do with it is show you an example from Coveo Search, which is a really, really powerful search application you can put on a website. And where I'm going to show it to you is from Salesforce. So if I click on the search button here, and I just type in CRM, you'll notice up here in the URL, the query parameter is a #Q. GA4's standard search implementation doesn't recognize that. So this search will never show up in GA4. You have to have a different way of capturing the search terms. And for me, capturing search terms has always been an important part of an implementation, of an analytics implementation. So how do they do that? They do that through a data layer push. And Salesforce implementation of Coveo is actually a pretty simple one. I've worked on some really complex ones. Coveo is an incredibly rich search app that you can add onto a website. But let's look at this now with our analytics debugger and see what's going on. This is the first time that's come up. This debugger has come up on the page. So I'm going to start debugging. And let's just do that whole thing again. Go to the page, type that in. Oops. So this time we'll do CRM analytics, just to make things a little bit different. Okay, so we've got the analytics. What our data layer push, you wouldn't know it. I don't like their naming convention too much, but whatever. They've got a lot going on the site. This is a data layer push. There's the event, cust EV site search, the event category, and here's, notice how this is set up for kind of UA, but it's repurposed for GA4. Here, CRM analytics, that's the term that I actually entered. So Coveo is doing a data layer push to send important information, in this case, the term that I actually entered, into the data layer. And then what is GA4 going to do with that? Or what is GTM going to do with that to send it to GA4? What GA4 is going to end up with is this search event. So here's the event name of search. And there are a ton of event parameters on here. Obviously, these guys have GA4 360. But if you keep scrolling down, like next to the last, there is a search term. So it's important to capture search terms. If you're using Coveo, you can't use the built-in GA4 search term capture because it doesn't recognize the parameters up here. So you have to do that through a data layer push, which Coveo provides. And once you have that data layer push, you can do with it whatever you want. In this case, we're recreating a search event in GA4 based on the data from the data layer push. And honest to God, I mean, there's so much you can do with like just putting in faux CSS classes and data attributes. But if you have access to a developer and you can work with them and you can set up some really good data layer pushes to really capture rich, meaningful information about interactions on your website, that's like heaven. That is just the sweetest place to be in. All right, back to, there's that example. Next thing I want to talk about, and this is kind of interesting. It's using tracking of an interaction to see if this is if something is a good idea. Now, I'm kind of protecting the client here, so I've gotten rid of their branding. I've gotten rid of anything that will show you who they are. But this is a B2B manufacturer, and for when you first arrive on their website, you're a brand new visitor. This 41-second video will autoplay. And you cannot do anything. You can scroll, but you can't click on anything else. So you are locked in to watching this video until, of course, you click the X. So I was in a meeting with them about 3 weeks ago, and I said, you know what, I'm not sure that's a really great idea. I mean, nobody really likes an auto-playing, totally blocking video. And I have some session recordings. I've got Microsoft Clarity on here. I've got some session recordings. Let's take a look at how people are interacting with that. So we looked at, a random collection of 12. And as you might guess, people click that X button pretty quickly. And I said, just based on that, I don't have actual data, but my gut on this, and based on the session recordings we saw, I don't think you ought to have this on your homepage blocking everybody. And they said, no, we like it. We think it's really good, which you're allowed to do. They said, give me some data, capture some data on people's interaction with that, which is a very fair point. And frankly, it's what I should have done in the first place. So I set this up. I set up a timer, and then I when they click on the X, I look at the timer, and it's in whole seconds basically, and I figure out if they clicked it in within 1 second of landing, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, etc., up to 60. I figured by the time if they hit 60, since the video is only 41 seconds long, if they hit 60, they're probably off on a different browser or something. So the data is kind of interesting. And I just set this up last week before Thanksgiving, which is a holiday here in the States. I'm sure you guys know that. And so there's not a lot of traffic, but you can see of the 102 new visitors who came to this website, 17% of them hit the X within 2 seconds. Some really fast ones hit it. 2 really fast people hit it within 1 second, 15 within 3, 14 within 4. Here's the data that we need to say, people don't like this. They're closing it as quickly as they can. So this is an unusual tracking, but it's a way to use GTM and capture data about a meaningful user interaction, i.e., please close this video and as quickly as we can. So I'm going to run this for another week or two, and then I'm going to share it with the client. But it's pretty clear that nobody wants that video playing, which is probably not a surprise to you guys. All right, forms, the next thing. Forms are such an important part of a website, of course, and how you track it, there are multiple different ways. So one way is you track it when somebody clicks on the submit button. Yuck. Obviously, you don't want to do that because they may not have filled out the form correctly. You're going to get a lot of false positives. You could also track it when they go to a thank you page. Yeah, that's better. But if they refresh that page, you might get double counting. If they bookmark it for some reason, you get people coming back to it. So that's not great. The best is a data layer push, like we saw with Coveo and earlier on. And that is at the point that the person has filled out the form correctly and all the form validation logic has occurred, do a data layer push, and then GTM can grab that and say form completed. We could spend a lot of time on this, but I'm not going to. I'm going to refer you instead to this excellent blog post from my buddy Julius over at Analytics Mania on form tracking with GTM and GA4. And here's a QR code if you want, and the URL. I still haven't addressed maybe the most important question, which is with all these things, what are you going to call that event? And let's start with the form tracking. If you look at the options that Google gives you, the closest thing is a generate lead. And it even says a user submits a form or a request for information. So this is one of the recommended events in GA4. And you think, okay, maybe that's the event name that I should use, generate lead. But if we go in and take a look at the parameters that describe that event, there are 2 that they come up with, currency and value. So, that's not what I think about when someone fills out a form. I mean, yeah, there's value to that, but I want to know, like, what form did they fill out? What page were they on? Things like that, which is totally missing here. So it's like, Google, dude, you've got a lot of people who are B2B and they want to know which forms got filled out. So what to call it is really kind of an art in GA4 implementation. We haven't talked, but you probably know that GA4 has 4 different event types: automatic, enhanced measurement, recommended, like the one we just saw, and custom. And they pushed really hard initially for recommended. Use recommended events as much as you possibly can and don't use custom. And I bought into that for like a year and a half. And then it's like, no, this makes no sense. Custom is your friend, because generate lead is nowhere near as good as form submitted or contact us form submitted or request a quote submitted or whatever. So I've totally changed my thinking around event names moving forward. And what I think is really important now is that when you create a custom event, something that is capturing interactions exclusively on your website, be descriptive. It's your event. It's your custom event. So CTA rather than button, form submitted rather than generate lead. Just use a name, create a name that makes sense to you, that makes sense when you're looking in the analytics. Simo Hava at one point mentioned use verbose nomenclature, i.e., another way of saying be descriptive. Now, you can't go over 40 characters. If you go over 40 characters, it gets truncated. The event name gets truncated to 40 characters. But be as descriptive and as verbose as you need to be. I think that's really important. And then finally, in general, with parameters and with parameter names and with event names, always use snake case, and that's all lowercase, underscore where there's a space. And that's going to make things, it won't break things if you don't do this, but it's going to make it easier for you to find these events and these parameters in GA4 and particularly in the explorations area. So just be consistent. Google is always using snake case. I strongly recommend you do that. And again, that's for event names and parameter names. Now, the value of the parameter, like contact us form, if that was a value, feel free to use capitalization or whatever there. What goes in there doesn't matter, but the name of that parameter, like form underscore name, that should be snake case. There are an unlimited number of events that you can have in GA4, limited to 500 if you're running one of the apps, but don't go crazy. You really don't, you're not going to have 500 meaningful user interactions on your website to track. 20, 25, maybe, you know, that's good. So just don't go overboard with them. Now, event parameters, excuse me, you can have up to 500, or you can have unlimited number of events. You do have limitations on event parameters within the GA4 UI. So as much as possible, use existing parameters. And where are those, Fred? Those are, this is what I call my Rosetta Stone page. This page on Google, which you will, if you click on that link or QR code, it'll take you here. This shows you all about the automatic, enhanced, recommended events, including, like, so many times you're going to be able to use these parameters, or like on the file download, the link text, link URL, things like that. Those are parameters that you're going to be able to reuse and reuse throughout your GA4 implementation. And the fact that this parameter is related to file download doesn't mean that you can't use it anyplace else. You can. Any of these parameters you can use any place that you want. So as much as possible, use the recommended ones before you create a custom parameter. I hope that kind of makes a little bit of sense. Then if we look at the recommended events, I just showed you this, but like search, if we look at the parameters around that, it'll come up here in just a second. The parameters around search are search term. So that's something that you could use if that was relevant to you. So the event parameters, use existing ones as much as possible, maximum of 50 in the user interface. And if you want to use them within the interface, like on an event card or something, you have to register them. You go into the configure section, into custom definitions, and then, excuse me, you have to create them. I won't show that here, but just know that if you create a custom parameter, it's not going to show up in your GA4 unless you register it. So just be forewarned on that. And the final thing I'll end with is that you may have a nice set of event category, action, and labels from your GA3 setup. You may be one of the few people who actually did that well, but don't be tempted to replicate that in GA4. And the reason for that is that the event model is so much richer in GA4 than it was in Universal Analytics. So take the time to really think about what events and what parameters you want to track. You have, again, up to 25 parameters to describe that event. Make use of them, not all 25 probably, but make use of them. Use them judiciously. Make the events that you create and the parameters that you're using make a lot of sense on your website. Don't recreate the stuff that you had on GA3. So at the end of all that, do you have a complete kitchen? Is your house all set up and everything? I like to think not. This is what I think of as when I'm done with some of my major GA4 implementations, I feel like I'm more here. A lot of the work is done, but a website is not a static thing. Monitoring user interactions are not static. So I feel like you will continue to monitor your analytics, monitor the website, and continue to add tracking or change tracking depending on what you're seeing coming in from the data. So this for me is the state of a good GA4 implementation. Not this one, not this one. This is too fixed. Here, you know there's going to be more stuff coming. All right, so that is it from me. I would like my dog Shusha to thank you guys all for coming and staying through this presentation. We do have a special offer for people who have come through here. You can work with our SEO or ads team to get help there and to get GA4 help as well. So again, a QR code and a link. I think you'll get this afterwards too, but at any rate, so here we are. And if you wanted to follow me, I'm Fred Pike on Twitter, and I'm now becoming more active on Mastodon, but I'm on LinkedIn also, and Northwoods is at nwsdigital.com. So thank you. I hope this was useful. And let's see if there are any questions. Oh yeah, a whole chat which I've missed.